Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.
Thank you for listening in today. I really don't know what the heck I'm doing starting a podcast, but I'm going to figure it out over time. So you bear with me, and we'll see how it goes. I do, however, have plenty to talk about and plenty of stories to tell. I have met many amazing people in my life, most of them just plain folks like you and me, and that I think you should meet. Some have been my friends over 60 years. Others I met along the way. And there are others that most people missed. There'll be amazing stories here of people who I believe will inspire you, motivate you, and teach you important life lessons. You will have the opportunity to laugh, think, and cry. By the way, my name is Bruce Goddard, and I really am an undertaker. A country undertaker, a fourth-generation country undertaker from the little town of Reynolds, Georgia, to be exact. An undertaker who undertook for half of his career in small rural towns called Reynolds, Georgia, and Roberta, Georgia. I would not take $1 million for growing up in Reynolds, by the way, where welcome to Reynolds and hurry back was on the same sign. I view life from a hearse. I really can't help it. I just do. Having dealt with death all my life, I think I see life differently than most of you. I went on my first death call with my daddy when I was a young teenager. You know, when I think about it, I've been viewing life from a hearse since I was 13 years old. In fact, I think I'll just pause and let you hear that story as I was telling it before a live audience many years ago.
You know, some of the funniest things happen at the most serious times. Y'all ever known that? I mean, that's when things really are funny, when it's not supposed to be funny. I got to tell you, when I was 13 years old, my daddy wanted me to go with him on my first death call. Now, I got to tell you, 13 is kind of young to be going on a death call. Somebody died, and we had to go get them, and Daddy said, "Son, it's time for you to go with me." And I was nervous. I mean, I was worried if I could pick up my side of the stretcher. For one thing, I was a kid, and we drove out of this house, and I'm telling you, when we pulled up at this house, there were cars on both sides of the road. There were people all out in the yard. There were people on this wraparound front porch. I mean, my heart sunk. I'm thinking, this must be the mayor. You know, this is somebody important. I learned something that night, by the way. I don't know how it is where y'all live, but where I come from Taylor County, Georgia, there's something about death that makes people think of tater salad. Listen, I'm serious about that. Listen, you can be in the hospital. The doctor can come out of the operating room, pull the mask off his face, call the family together and say, "I'm sorry, Grandpa didn't make it. My Lord, let me go home and make some tater salad." That's the first thing everybody does. Well, I was relieved that night to find that out. I'm thinking, well, maybe this man ain't that important, you know? Everybody just bringing tater salad to the house. That made me feel better. But I stood out by the hearse and while Daddy went in to talk to the family, and finally he came back, and I had him get that stretch up his flight of steps, and I remember it was a big wraparound porch. Several doors went in that house off that porch. We rolled the stretch up to one of the doors, and Daddy said, "Bruce, the man is in this room. You roll the stretch on in and wait on me. I'm going to go talk to this family." 13 years old. I remember like it was yesterday. I rolled the stretch in the room. The man was laying on the bed. I rolled the stretch up next to the bed, and I'm standing there. I'm thinking, "Daddy, whatever you're doing, please hurry up." And I knew I was in over my head, and I looked down, and I thought I saw the man move. Now, I'm going to tell you something. I backed up. And I'm thinking, you know, surely this man's dead. They wouldn't have the undertaker out here with all this tater salad. You know, man hadn't really passed away. So I got myself together, and I eased back up to the bed. I'm thinking I'm hallucinating. I'm too young to be doing this. And about that time, I looked down, the man reached up and scratched his nose. I'm going to tell y'all something. I wasn't but 13 years old. But you ain't got to be a rocket scientist to figure out, they out there picking out pallbearers. This man here scratches his nose. We got problems, you know? So I went out looking for Daddy. I met him coming in. I said, "Daddy, I need to talk to you." He said, "Son, we can talk on the way to the funeral home. The family's ready for us to move him to the funeral home." I said, "Daddy, I believe I need to talk to you before we move him to the funeral home." He said, "Son, what is your problem?" I said, "Daddy, the man's not dead." And Daddy looked at me, looked across the room. The man that was dead was in a chair on the other side of the room. I was on there with his... invalid father who was laying in the bed. I'll tell y'all, there's a moral to that story. When y'all call the undertaker to come to your house, be doggone sure they get the right fella. Him, it can absolutely happen. I mean, it really can.
Yep, I got my perspective in life, honestly. So let me explain about telling a story to a live audience. Besides being a country undertaker, I've also been a humorist and motivational speaker for almost 3 decades. I have spoken to nursing home lobbies where the audience had no idea what I was talking about, neither did I, to civic clubs, many civic clubs, where you have to be done before the top of the hour. The audience will spring on you out the door like someone having to suddenly go to the restroom, or maybe more likely to work. I've spoken to large conventions, sales rallies, intoxicated groups, AA meetings, and church groups. I even spoke to a group one time of about 40 people, which included a former president and first lady of the United States. I had been booked to speak to the Plains, Georgia Historical Society. This was probably about 20 years ago. When I arrived, I noticed a couple of guys standing out front with earpieces in their ears. Now, that was unusual back then. Today, most everybody has earpieces in their ears. It was never difficult for me to find the person who invited me to speak at an event. They were always standing at the door waiting on me in case I didn't show up, and I guess they thought they may have to do the speaking. I shook the man's hand and we exchanged pleasantry. I couldn't help but ask him if President Carter would be at this event after what I had just seen. He pointed to a large SUV that was pulling up in front of the building. I watched as Jimmy and Rosalind Carter got out of that vehicle. This was obviously a covered dish supper, because I had also noticed that Jimmy and Rosalind both had a plate of food in their hands as they walked in the building. Incredible. I was standing at the door, and my new friend introduced me to President and Mrs. Carter. As we shook hands, President Carter said, "I've read about you." I laughed. I told him I'd read about him too. When they walked on by into the room, I asked the man who had invited me to speak if President Carter was serious. He told me President Carter is a speed reader and reads most of the county newspapers in Georgia. Since I'd been on a Chamber of Commerce tour, speaking at banquets all over Georgia, I suppose he had read about me. As I entered the room where we would eat and I would speak, I couldn't help but notice the people in the room did not pay special attention to the Carters. I did notice when dinner was ready that they did call on the former president to say grace. I was sitting at a round table with 5 or 6 other folks. I couldn't help but watch the former leader of the free world as they were sitting with others at the table next to me. As it was getting close to going on, I almost had a panic attack. Some of my stories stretch people a little. My wife tells me there's some stories I probably shouldn't tell. I'm thinking, should I change my talk since a former president of the United States is in the room? Should I tell the Sid and Eula Maul story? As my mind was racing, I was quickly introduced and standing at the podium. I was standing in front of the Carter's table. I literally could have reached out and touched them. I did tell that story.
Right outside of Reynolds, about 2 miles outside of town, was a man on Highway 96 going towards Fort Valley. Was a man who lived, his name was Sid. And Sid and my granddaddy were very good friends. They were close friends. But Sid, this happened probably in the early 50s, and Sid's been dead a long time. But Sid got a bad case of the itch. And it's the kind of itch you ain't supposed to talk about in a public place, but he had it, and I'm going to talk about it in just a minute, and y'all know what I'm talking about. But Sid went downtown to our local drugstore. Clay Watley was a druggist in Reynolds back then, and Sid went in there, had a funny look on his face, said, "Clay, you got to help me. I can't sleep at night. I'm keeping Eula mauled up. She can't sleep. You got to give me something." So Clay went in the back, and you know how pharmacists used to do years ago, and he mixed Sid a concoction in this little medicine bottle of all this stuff that pharmacists used to mix up. And finally he came out and he said, "Sid, I know you're hard-headed, but listen to me. This stuff in this little bottle right here will last you the rest of your life." He said, "Sid, this stuff is hot." He said, "What you need to do is you go home and you fill your bathtub up with cool water. And Sid, right before you sit in that tub, you dab this stuff on you. Sid, a little dab will do you. It ain't going to take much. This stuff is hot. So Sid went home. He went in the bathroom, filled his tub up with cool water. He stood up there and stood by the tub, dabbed a little on him, and he was thinking, if a little bit would help, I believe the whole bottle would help a whole lot more. And he emptied that bottle out. He rubbed it all over him. He sat in the tub. A couple of minutes went by. He yelled out, "Ulamald!" Ulamald came to the bathroom door and said, "Sid, what you want?" Said, "Go get the car." Said, "Sid, are you in the bathtub?" Said, "Ulamald, for one time in your life, please do what I'm asking you to do. Go outside, get the car, get in it, and come to the back door and honk the horn." Said, "Sid, you've lost your mind." So Ulamald, y'all think I'm lying, I can take it right to the house. Ulamald went out, she got the car, she drove it to the back door. There was a screen door back there. She honked the horn. Sid jumped out of the tub. He was butt naked, ran outside, jumped on the hood of the car, pulled both legs back, said, "Now drive, woman, drive." Listen, hood ornaments were invented in Reynolds, Georgia. That's where they were started. When I told you I was from Reynolds, Georgia, y'all knew you heard of it, and that's why hood ornaments were invented there.
I tell you, Jimmy Carter did not just laugh that night. He was slapping his legs as he was laughing, out loud. It was one of the best audiences I ever had, and I had a blast. A photographer there took my picture with the Carters after I spoke. A few days later, I received that photo in the mail from President. My speaking has taken me all across the land, from California to Georgia and from Canada to Mexico. I believe last I counted, I've stood in front of audiences in almost 40 of our states. My speaking introduced me to writing, or maybe vice versa. I know people were always coming up to me after an engagement telling me, "You should write a book." I finally did that. The book, entitled View from a Hearse, Lighten Up, was just an extension of what I'd been talking about, including funny stories of my unique profession, and at the same time telling a bigger story about life from the perspective of a small-town undertaker. Then I started writing a blog. I had never heard of a blog until a friend told me I should write one. I started doing that, writing mainly about people in my life or people I met along the way. I ended up writing over 800 blog articles before Facebook taught me I could reach more people through their social media site. Although I have to tell you, I never really started writing articles to reach more people. When you view life from a hearse, you want to write stuff down for your children and grandchildren to have one day, because I happen to know really well that I won't be here forever. My second book, The Legacy of Eulin Brown, is made up of a few blog stories out of that 800 I wrote. The truth is, I didn't even make the decision of what articles would be included in that book. I made sure a few were included, but I let my brother-in-law decide that. He was the publisher. Besides being an undertaker, I spent over 2 of the last decades of my life working for a public company that owns and operates funeral homes and cemeteries throughout the United States and Canada. I began my career with them in 1998 after selling my 2 small-town rural funeral homes. When I started, they made me an area manager, managing a few funeral homes and cemeteries in middle Georgia. Somehow, with lots of luck and being at the right place at the right time, when I retired in this past April, I had responsibility for hundreds of funeral homes and thousands of people all across the country. Through that journey, I worked for and with some of the most amazing leaders in our country. And trust me, I did learn from them. And then that led me to speak to many groups over the years in the business world on leadership. Additionally, and more importantly, I've been a husband to my bride for coming up on 45 years. I laughingly tell her if she leaves me now, I'm just going to go with her. You will certainly get to hear from her on this podcast. I am also the imperfect dad of my 3 imperfect grown sons, all of whom I am extremely proud and who have taught me so much. You will also most likely hear from all 3 and even a few spouses along the way. If I can figure out how to get a few of our 9 grandchildren on here, I will do that as well. The most important thing you'll discover about me is I'm a person of faith, a man who knows he's been blessed by God. You will find a bit of that sprinkled through all this. It doesn't matter if you're a believer or not. I just want you to be aware. So I have plenty of material. If I can just figure out all the technical stuff of creating, producing this podcast, we'll be up and running. People told me I should write a book. I did. Others told me I should write a blog. I did that. Others told me I should post articles on Facebook. I certainly have done that. Since my retirement, people have told me I should do a podcast. So here we are. I think I can explain the purpose or goal of this podcast by telling you a story. Remember, I'm a storyteller at heart. And if you hang around this podcast, you're going to hear plenty of those. In 1983, I was glued to the television watching the finals of the NCAA basketball tournament. A team named North Carolina State, led by a coach named Jimmy Valvano, had made it to the finals. They were not supposed to be there. The mantra was win and advance. Somehow they had won. They beat University of Georgia in the Final Four. I'm a big Georgia fan. I went to the University of Georgia, and I couldn't believe this team had made it to the finals. The problem is they were playing the University of Houston, known as Phi Slamma Jamma. That team had two future NBA Hall of Famers on their team, Hakeem Olajuwon and Clyde the Glide Drexler. They played above the rim, and that was before teams played above the rim. When you look and read the articles in the paper, the question was not if the University of Houston would win the game, but the question was how bad would they beat North Carolina State. But I was glued to the TV that night watching that game, and I could not believe at halftime North Carolina State was ahead. The game went back and forth, and Jimmy Valvano, who had been a darling to the media, he was funny, he cut up, he had that team playing above anything they thought they could play. On the last play of that game, a guy by the name of Lorenzo Charles, who's buried within a chip shot of Jimmy Valvano in Raleigh, North Carolina, I've been to that grave, he caught a pass, or it may have been a shot that he intercepted, and he dunked the ball as seconds clicked off the clock, and North Carolina State upset the University of Houston. It is one of the top 10 sporting events of all time, according to ESPN. I was absolutely jumping up and down in my den. I could not believe that North Carolina State had beat the University of Houston. People were going crazy. Jimmy Valvano ran out on the court. He couldn't find anybody to hug. You can watch that video. You can Google it. It was incredible. It was just an incredible moment in sports. It was an incredible moment for the good guys. I'll never forget it. 10 years later, in 1993, I had read that Jimmy Valvano was going to receive the Arthur Ashe Award on the ESPY TV show. And I believe this was the first ESPY show that they ever had in 1993. I knew Jimmy Valvano had cancer, and there was a question of whether he would even be able to be there to receive that award. But I knew I was going to be watching it, and I can tell you I was sitting in front of the television when that show came on. In fact, I read the night before that Jimmy Valvano would not be there. He was just unable because of the cancer and his illness. But when I turned the TV on that night, I saw him. He was there. They called him to the stage, and it took two people, one on each side of him, to walk him up the stairs to get him to the podium. I want to tell you, he did not look like the same man that he looked like 10 years ago when he had won that game. I was blown away. Jimmy Valvano stood in front of that podium and gave the strongest 6-minute speech I have ever heard in all my life. To this day, you can go Google it, listen to that Never Give Up speech. It is the most incredible speech I've ever heard. It's the most motivating, inspirational speech I've ever heard. He died less than 6 weeks after giving this speech, and he used every bit of his energy to give it. One of the things he did, he was laughing because obviously they did not have time for him to speak. They didn't think he was coming, and obviously a light was blinking telling me his time was up, and he stopped what he was saying and said, "You guys are telling me my time is up? I've got tumors all over my body. You think I could give a rip if my time is up on this stage?" But he gave an incredible speech, and one of the things he said, and what I took with me more than anything else he said there are 3 things you should do every day of your life. He said, number 1, you should laugh. You should find a way to move your smiles into laughter. And number two, you should think. You should think about what's important to you, what's important to the people that's important to you, and what's important to God. And number three, you should cry. Have your emotions move to tears, whether tears of happiness or tears of sadness. He said, if you can laugh, think, and cry in a day, you will get home that night and you will say you had a heck of a day. If you can figure out how to do that in a week or a month, you're going to have a wonderful month. If you can figure out how to do that in a year, you will have a wonderful year. If you can figure out how to live a life where you're laughing, thinking, and crying on a daily basis, you will have a wonderful life. In fact, you will sit on the porch of your nursing home one day, if you're fortunate enough to do that, and look back on your life and say, I had a wonderful life. What I learned after listening to that speech is that to do that, to give yourself a chance to laugh, think, and cry in a day, you have to engage people. Things won't ever do that. That speech had a major impact on my life. In fact, I began, after hearing that speech in 1993, to try to live intentionally to engage people, to slow down enough to talk to people and listen to their story. I can tell you story after story after story of people I've engaged to give them an opportunity to make me laugh, think, and cry. And I want to tell you, everybody you engage won't do that, but it is worth the effort. I can tell you about a shoe shine guy in the Atlanta airport. He was shining my shoes. I was intentionally engaging him. He had me laughing. I was laughing so hard I was crying. At some point, I asked him how long he'd been shining shoes. He told me 50-something years, I think he said. He said he shined Martin Luther King's shoes. And now he had my attention. And I asked him about his family. He said he'd been married for 50-something years. And he had 2 daughters that were college graduates. To say the least, Brian impacted my life that day. And we became friends. I'd see him almost weekly when I came through the airport. The problem is I had a hard time letting him shine my shoes. I wanted to shine his shoes. I've got a lot of stories like that I look forward to sharing with you. But the thing that has hit me over the years, I understand to be successful, we have to know where we're going. We start at point A and we go to point B. The challenge is, I believe, our tendency is on our quest to get to point B, that we run over everybody in between, that we miss the people God has put in our life to get us to point B. And we think we're doing the right thing by pressing ahead. And some of the greatest lessons we're almost blind to. All of us have a tendency to hang around and look for people that look like us, that thinks like us, that believes like us. And I want to tell you, I'm absolutely convinced when we do that, we miss God's best for us. Certainly there are people that are in our lives that are supposed to be in our lives, that are obviously in our lives to impact our lives. But there are also a lot of people that we miss along the way. These people make our lives richer. They make us laugh. They make us think. And they make us cry. And we'll be better if we take our time and are willing to be disrupted on the path from point A to point B. So that's my goal in this podcast, is to give all of us the opportunity when you tune in to laugh, think, and cry. If we're able to do that when the podcast is over, you will be able to say, I had a heck of a day. Thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to figuring out how to do this as we go forward. God bless you. We will be back. Thank you.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.